welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. with a busy week as the world depression and the world strategic crisis unfolds. Let's go right away to Syria. We've had, in the last 24 hours, a psychotic episode in public by Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has won the Ribbentrop Award, awarded in the tradition of Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi foreign minister who had a bad end after Nuremberg. His hypocrisy, his superficiality, his stupidity, his hysteria were watchwords. We have had a real hysterical rant by Hillary Clinton at the French conference called Amis du Peuple Syrien, the friends of the Syrian people. Man, with friends like this, you don't need enemies. They want to hit the Syrian people with more killer economic sanctions, economic warfare. These are the stranglers who are in command for the moment. The bombers, of course, eager to seize control. Hillary Clinton, of course, is a bomber. Her personality weakness is such that unless she's the biggest warmonger in the room, she has a psychological breakdown, because that means she's weak, and of course that lets her in on all of these terrible things that have been said about women for all these years. So the answer to being a woman is to be essentially the biggest butcher and warmonger around, and then you can feel safe. Well, that is exactly the definition of weakness, as I've tried to point out quite a few times. So her weakness was on parade. And the tirade was against Russia and China, really more than Assad. Russia and China, she says, have been blocking the wonderful international community in their desire to overthrow the existing government of Syria, which is a United Nations member state. So she says it's time to, for everybody, I think there are 60 countries taking part in this confab, not Russia, not China, not Syria, as usual, right? The Munich model obtains. Don't invite the country that's being discussed. So she says it's time for the 60 who did come to put Russia and China under pressure, that it's time for them to pay a price. She raves. So far they haven't paid a price, but now everybody here has got to gang up on them and make sure that they pay a price for their behavior. And then we had her lapdog this time around was the German foreign minister, Guido Westerwelle, who says the Russians are on the wrong side of history and they've got to understand that. Oh, my God. Another step down for the Merkel regime, and another step closer to being thrown out of office, because the economic future of Germany, needless to say, depends on good relations with Russia, not disturbed by these idiotic issues that are brought in by the Anglo-Americans. Fabius, our friend Le Roquet, right, the attack dog, the cur, Laurent alias the cur, Fabius, gloats over the defection of a general. This is now the son of a guy called Tlas. Well, if you've been around the Middle East for a while, you know Tlas. This name is already a program. Tlas has now become a hero of democracy. Okay, Tlas has a father. His father has been the defense minister in Syria for quite a few decades. And this is a guy who said, I sent the suicide bombers to kill the U.S. Marines, but he didn't send them to kill the Italians because he was in love with Gina Lollobrigida, the famous actress. And he's also got another speech where he celebrates what he alleges was cannibalism against Israeli prisoners on the Golan Heights. So that's the father. So this is now the hero of democracy. The son of that is now the hero of democracy. And, of course, the elder Tlas was a feature of the Hafez Assad regime, which I think, based on my experience in Syria, was oppressive. The Hafez Assad regime was something more akin to what the U.S. and the British say about Bashar. But of course, Bashar is a reformer. This is exactly what they don't like. So when you had Hafez Assad, we had Henry Kissinger saying, I have a soft spot in my heart for Hafez Assad, and they always did. But now that you have a modernizing reformer in the person of Bashar, and the situation strategically has changed, now they want to overthrow the government. So the son of Tlas, that's really a great credential. Anyway, Fabius thought that was great. Of course, radically anti-historical, can't remember any of this other stuff. Maybe some groups will remind him of what's going on. Lavrov, since we're talking about foreign ministers, Lavrov of Russia was asked this week, is it true that Moscow is going to offer President Assad diplomatic asylum here, political asylum in Russia? And he said, this is a joke. This is a bad joke. And the hapless Westerwelle was there for that one, too. And Lavrov said, why don't you ask Westerwelle here whether they're going to take him in Germany? An interesting turn of phrase. So that is the Friends of Syria conference. We're also told behind the scenes, the Gulf monarchies, the feudal, absolute, reactionary monarchies of the Gulf, right? The United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, the various Oman and Saudi Arabia above all, right? The Jupiter around which all of these things rotate. They're pessimistic. They say the Free Syrian Army is not effective. The Free Syrian Army, we had to hear on NPR this morning, is not as good as the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. Not as good. Not as good as the fighters led by Belhaj Hassadi coming out of Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk. Not as good. So the Free Syrian Army is militarily feckless. One of their strongholds near Idlib has been conquered by the Syrian, or retaken, liberated by the Syrian army today. So the Gulf states are getting nervous about the bet that they're making on people who are this feckless. And of course, the question comes up, if these Gulf states are so concerned about the Syrian-Iranian bloc, how come they haven't embargoed oil to these countries, to, in particular, China, right? Since the big hysteria is about Russia and China. China needs oil imports. The Gulf could do some, but you don't see them doing it. So, as usual, ready to fight to the last American or ready to fight to the last NATO trooper, but not willing to do anything. Just a sidelight on the hypocrisy of these people. We do have an interesting statement from the Iraqi foreign minister. The Iraqi foreign minister says, Al-Qaeda is streaming into Syria. The terrorists of the entire Eurasian landmass operating under the Al-Qaeda trademark are streaming into Syria big time. And we've also got a very interesting sidelight. Switzerland has cut off arms shipments to Qatar and the United Arab Emirates because they've found hand grenades in Syria being used, obviously, by the butchers, by the NATO death squads deployed by the Negroponte Ford combine. Those hand grenades made in Switzerland, so the Swiss are getting freaked out. And obviously they're afraid of liability issues, right? People who get killed with that can sue the Swiss government. So there we go with this situation. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just one other note on this guy, Tlas, right? The apparently Sunni son, the general, son of the long-term defense minister of Syria, going back to the bad old days of Hafez Assad, right, when things really were rather constricted. This group, when you talk to people in Syria, they will tell you that there's an old guard around Bashar Assad, and the old guard is inherited from Hafez Assad. And the people in this old guard regard themselves as heroes, but the population regards them as thieves. And I think that's probably the case of this guy, Tlas. So the defection celebrated so shamelessly by Fabius Le Roquet, right, the cur. This involves this character this is a very, very dubious guy, very dubious family. If his father's heritage lives on in him, it's better to lose him than to find him. So this is a public relations problem, not a plus, not a game changer, as they're trying to discuss. Now, we've also got the political farce of the Syrian National Council. We've already heard that the Free Syrian Army is feckless. Even the Gulf reactionaries think this is a dubious bet. But now let's look at the Free Syrian Army, so-called. The Syrian National Council, all in quotes, naturally. Syrian National Council. The Syrian National Council had a meeting in Cairo, and here it degenerated into a brawl. Yes, a fist fight, violence, fisticuffs, punches were thrown, chairs flew through the air. And here's the factional breakdown. There are three main groups in this show, right? The common denominator they have is they like to meet in hotels, they like to jet around the world, they like to stay in hotels and get paid for by NATO taxpayer money and Saudi money or anybody's money. They'll take any. So they're in Cairo right now, or were this past week. I think it's the 3rd of July. And the meeting was supposed to vote a common delegation that they could send on to these other events that are unfolding. And the group split into three parts. First of all is a group which I guess we could call the Al-Qaeda foreign fighters, or maybe it's fairer to call it just the Muslim Brotherhood group in general, right? So it's the Muslim Brotherhood group, the majority, and then these other groups come into it. They're not identical, but they've gravitated in there in order to form a faction. And then you've got a second group called the Coordination. Now, the Coordination, we followed them. They're the ones that are more inside the country than outside. The Muslim Brotherhood, in this case, is Saudi-financed, and their center of gravity is outside the country. But they do have these foreign fighters. They have the death squads connected to them. The Coordination is more inside the country. And then you have the Kurds, which are a minority in Syria as well as in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, the surrounding areas. So here was the faction fight, first of all. The Kurds wanted a reference to their national aspirations put into a key document that this meeting was supposed to approve. And this was completely voted down. So at that point, the Kurds walked out. Now, that's significant. It means that under a government of this Syrian National Council, the Kurdish separatism would turn into a regional war in its own right, reaching into Turkey inevitably. Erdogan, please take note. If you attack Syria, you bring down Assad, then you're going to get rebellions of Kurds, and it's going to be, whatever you think of the Kurdish aspirations one way or another, a general war in the Middle East is not worth it. I'm sorry. From our point of view, no. Do it peacefully, but don't have it lead to a regional war or indeed World War III. So forget that part. The Kurds walk out. Then we have recriminations between the other two groups. The Muslim Brotherhood group attacks the Coordination, saying, you people in the Coordination are agents of Assad. You are stooges of the Ba'ath Party regime. You're no good. The Coordination answers, I think with even greater vehemence, you, Muslim Brotherhood, are NATO puppets. You are tools of foreigners, of the Saudis, of NATO, and the rest of it. A lot to be said for that analysis, I guess. So it divides into three parts. And then we get a fist fight between the Muslim Brotherhood guys and the Coordination. The Coordination would tend to be more, I think, liberal, pro-Western, internet-oriented, or at least somewhat more than the Muslim Brotherhood type. So That's what you have. A fist fight, a brawl, women are weeping, men are punching, chairs go through the air. And what that shows is that if this group were in control in Damascus, you would get a civil war right away. It is a recipe for civil war. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at Libya. What's just happened in Libya? We've had several hundred people killed in fights among warlords of various types. And today the news is, and this won't please NATO, or maybe it will if they're speculating on an uptick, that the oil terminal in Libya has been shut down by one of the armed militias. Maybe that's precisely what they want, right? Maybe somebody is speculating that the price of oil can go up, right? That they want to constrict the supply because the price has been weak lately. So anyway, for Libya, it's chaos, right? There's some kind of an election going on in Libya, but everybody knows that it's an election being held at gunpoint. The Syrian election that was just held was 1,000,000 times better, right? With more than half of the people turning out and voting to some extent for non-Ba'ath Party candidates. That's 1,000,000 times better than what you're getting in Libya right now, where it's all at gunpoint, right? With these bearded guys who are going to kill you if you look at them the wrong way. That's the choice. In other words, Assad or chaos. It's an easy choice. Gaddafi or chaos a year ago should have been an easy choice. But of course, the destabilization now has to escalate. And we've been watching this guy, Ben Rhodes, in the Obama White House and the National Security Council. We've been watching his plan, first reported by Maison, to take over Arabsat, Nilesat, take over all of these Syrian state television, Adunia, Sham, and others, and start broadcasting CIA, NATO propaganda on there and have a coup. But now they've got precious help. In the week where normally the fist fight among the Syrian National Council would have been the story, Assange, little Lord Julian Assange, from his hangout at the Ecuadorian embassy in London and the WikiLeaks organization have come up with a new limited hangout. And of course, we can assume that somewhere upstream, you've got the limited hangout office of the CIA, of MI6, of ASIO, right, the Australian Secret Intelligence Organization. You've got all of them. We'll be back with more of that in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So now we're at the point where little Lord Julian Assange, after spending, a year and a half living like a lord in that beautiful country house on the border between Norfolk and Suffolk. I believe the house is owned by Vaughan Smith, former British intelligence officer, the head of the Frontline Club, a fairly obvious deployment, a fairly obvious up. But apparently for some people it's not obvious. Well, now we've got Assange doing what he does, helping NATO, helping the CIA, helping MI6, helping the DGSE, helping the Australian Secret Intelligence Organization, ASIO, I think it's called. He is a son of MK Ultra. He is doing his work, and his WikiLeaks gang are helping him. Remember, WikiLeaks never attacks the centers of imperialist power. They don't. They don't attack London. They don't attack New York. They don't attack Netanyahu and company. They don't attack Sarkozy, except, some little tidbits of gossip. But the heavy-duty stuff, we saw it in 2010. Who does it hit? The targets being Ben Ali, Gaddafi, Mubarak, Maliki, Karzai, Kirchner of Argentina, and so forth, right? People, and Berlusconi, and Putin, of course. People that the CIA really wants to harm and knock out, those are the ones who take it on the chin. And here it is again. In the middle of this situation, we don't get a series of WikiLeaks, as far as we can see, that say, here's how the imperialists are ganging up on Syria. No. This is now 2.43 million emails, 400,000 in Arabic, 68,000 in Russian, and it's all got to do with how bad Syria is. Oh, gosh, this regime, they're so bad, but above all, trying to slam the people that have been trading with Syria and trying to cut those ties, right? Trying to sabotage the logistical backup that Syria has. And it's always interesting. Typical target, Italy, right? As usual. Italy, the wild card of Western Europe in many ways. We know that there is a structural, permanent, long-term alliance between Italy and Russia. This goes beyond governments. It has been there for a long time. You could even take it back to the building of the Fiat plant in Tolyattigrad in the 1960s. It really even goes back to between the two world wars, right? The Italian interest in the Balkans. Anyway, this time, one of the suppliers of Syria that they target, Finmeccanica. Finmeccanica is a defense firm. It used to be part of IRI, right? It used to be a state-owned company. I think it's privatized now. But anyway, Finmeccanica, in particular, their branch, their affiliate, which is called Selex Elsag, Selexelsag, and that makes radios for Syria, for the Syrian army, I guess. So, scandal. And notice, instead of being boycotted and despised and slandered and insulted and denigrated, Assange has got a new media cartel. The previous media cartel, you'll remember them, The Guardian, The New York Times, Der Spiegel, El País, some others, right? He had them. But now he's got a new media cartel because he burned his bridges with The Guardian and The New York Times by getting into fights with the prostitutes at those places. Now he's got the following. The Associated Press. Well, the Associated Press is practically the only source of international news for most newspapers that are left here in the United States. Then he's got NDR and ARD. Well, that means essentially German television in general, right? The first program of the German television. The ARD is the national program, the first program of German TV, and NDR, North German Radio, North German Television. That's a component of that. So he's got the U.S. covered, he's got Germany covered. L'Espresso, Italian left liberal, pro-financier, radical chic news magazine. Okay, so U.S., Germany, Italy covered. What else do we have? Al-Akbar of Lebanon. This is interesting because he's peeling them off. They used to be pro-Assad, and now he's luring them into the somewhat away from Assad. And then Al-Masri al-Yum of Egypt. We've also got some smaller ones, OWNI, O-W-N-I of France, and Publico of Spain. So you got a NATO media consortium. This does not happen for people whom the ruling elite wants to suppress and silence. This is a soapbox for Assange. And, sad to tell, Russia Today. I think it is tragic to see Russia Today giving a lot of its time to Assange. They had this 12-part interview program with him, a tissue of banalities with Graeber and a bunch of anarchist wreckers who were gloating about how they destroyed the Occupy Wall Street, and then we just had Gnome Chomsky on there, and so on down the line. You look at Russia Today, it's often Ron Paul vision, sometimes it's Assange vision. I think it would be interesting to for them to have feedback. In other words, what intelligent and sophisticated people in the Western world or anywhere think about that. Maybe that's of interest to write a few emails or tweets about that. But it means that so far there's a vacuum. In other words, I don't see sufficient denunciation of Assange. And remember, you can do something about this. You go to Webster G. Tarpley on Twitter, and you'll find things there by the time this is posted. And that means, of course, today being the 6th of July, 2012, Friday, July 6th. By Saturday, July 7th, I'll have various responses to this going. If you agree with what I write, retweet it. Write your own. Watch different news outlets and comment on them. Twitter is a great way to provide feedback to these people. You notice that the British intelligence model here of WikiLeaks is evident. Back in the 1840s, 1850s, you had this guy Alexander Gertzen, and his publication was called The Polar Star, Polarnaya Zvezda. And the Polar Star was leaks from inside the Tsarist regime. It drove them crazy. It's supposed to be, autocratic, absolute, totalitarian, completely monolithic. And instead, of course, there's all this gossip and intrigue going on the inside. So Herzen got a hold of this stuff and put it out based in London. And that's really what we've got here. It's a typical modus operandi of British intelligence. And I have to talk to people, if you don't see that Assange is a deployment, that he's an op, then you really need to examine your own method of thinking, because that is emphatically what he is. And, of course, he can stay, this orchestration is to make him look like a victim. He's got to be a victim. Bradley Manning, this poor guy, he's a victim. Nothing much swirls around him. But Assange is now like Cardinal Mindszenty, right? Back in the 50s and 60s, Cardinal Mindszenty was living in the U.S. Embassy in Budapest, I believe, and challenging these Soviet occupiers and all this. So that's the idea. And this will now work itself out, right? There's a huge document dump, and they will now try to use a limited hangout. And you will see that there are various things put into that pile of stuff that are fake, that are doctored, that are written precisely for certain purposes. Now, but that's the end of our first hour. I guess we'll continue this in the next hour here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, as I've been saying. Later in the program, we got to mention it's July 2012. It's the 20th anniversary of George H.W. Bush, the unauthorized biography, the internet classic, which you need to own. You need to have a nice paper copy of this in your library. It is the book that exposed Prescott Bush as a backer of Hitler, that the Bush family fortune is tainted with money from Auschwitz and other concentration camps that were run by corporations that used slave labor during the Nazi regime, during World War II, that the Bushes were part of the apparatus that made tanks and guns to kill GIs, and later on, of course, that the Nixon smoking gun tape, the tape, not the blank tape, but the smoking gun tape, where he actually commits, he says he's committing perjury left and right, that the Texans that are referred to in that smoking gun tape are George Bush and his friends, right? That's why George Bush was so upset. You can read the scabrous details in the book, how he responded, how upset George Bush was when the smoking gun tape came out. Not because he wanted Nixon to stay, he wanted Nixon to go by that time, but because he thought he was going to be implicated too, and then he had to take a holiday in China for a year, get out of town so he wouldn't be subject to investigations. That's the 20th anniversary of that book now. It was introduced at a press conference here at the National Press Club in July. Maybe I can get you the exact date. July in the year 1992, in the middle of that election campaign 20 years ago. So great time to go to Amazon. You can get it, go through Tarpley.net. Now, we're talking about Assange. I guess we're done with Assange again, except to deplore the gullibility of world public opinion, because it really is too much. Okay, why is Hillary Clinton so hysterical? Well, part of it, they say, well, she's so frustrated because the Syrian thing is not working the way she wanted, right? She's being blocked by Russia and China, and she doesn't know what to do. Here's the other thing, right? Given this infantile weakness that she has, right, there's a real character flaw. She's not capable of being president. I'm sorry. Forget the 3 o'clock phone call, because the question for her is always, how do I prove to everybody that I'm not weak? That is exactly weakness, once again. So she had to say, I'm sorry, right? Being tough for Hillary means you never say you're sorry, but she had to say it, and specifically to Pakistan. She had to say to Pakistan, we're sorry, we're sorry that 27 of your soldiers were killed by the U.S. side. When you think about it, this is unbelievable. This should cost you nothing to do this. It should have been done within 6 hours. The United States government apologizes and offers to pay compensation to the victims of this tragic event, which we never wanted, right? That would have been competent window dressing statesmanship. But no, because of her weakness, they've sabotaged themselves. All those months, from November to now, the truck convoy routes from Karachi to the Khyber Pass have been cut. And now they finally get it going again. And now, of course, it's almost time for the trucks to start going in the other direction if they keep to their timetable, which I believe they will. They want to implement the Divine Plan, get the heavy infantry out of there, go with special forces, drones, airstrikes, and a much cheaper kind of butchery going on there. So I think maybe she was in a crisis. Maybe she'd been needled by various people about having to say that she was sorry, so she had to now overcompensate. But you see, this is exactly psychopathology. This is not competent, prudent leadership. Now, we've also got the situation with Iran. The new round of economic sanctions against Iran have gone into effect now. This is obviously another type of economic warfare. Rand Paul voted for it, little Rand. We'll get back to him later. He's been active also on the domestic front. We're looking at, in particular, at the missile drill. There was this missile drill, joint U.S.-Israeli anti-ballistic missile defense drill, which was scheduled for a while ago, and it's now going to be held, they're telling us, in October. Well, that's ominous, isn't it? October surprise. You get the idea, right? That's a hypothesis of October surprise. It is at least available now as an option to bootleg something real under the cover of the drill, as they always do, right? The thesis of my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA. So this is called Austere Challenge 12. And Austere Challenge 12, the U.S. and the Israelis anti-missile drills. The U.S. say that they have sent more minesweepers to the Gulf. They used to have 4, they now have 8. They've sent an amphibious assault ship, apparently one of the oldest ones, one that had been scheduled to be shut down. The Iranians say they can hit 35 U.S. bases within a couple of minutes. All of this because of the new round of Iran sanctions on oil sales. So the gloating on NPR, National Pentagon Radio, this morning is that fruit, sugar, and meat now cost more than they did. So that's not a good picture overall. Now let's lift and shift into domestic here. We need to continue considering the Supreme Court health care ruling and what's with that. Romney is, of course, flailing, right? Nobody knows what Romney thinks now, right? Romney first said, no, the individual mandate is not a tax; it's really a penalty or a fee. And all the Republicans then were screaming, no, it's a tax, right? For the Republicans, the simple crudity, right? The Pavlovian significance of the word tax is if you say tax, then the Republicans begin to salivate and drool and inveigh against it. So now he had his spokes come out, this guy Fehrenbach, I think it is, coming out and saying, Fehrenstrom came out saying, no, it's not a tax, but now Mitt says it's a tax. Now, this really is incompetent. In other words, you can begin to see it's the dumb rich guys, the rich dumb guys who don't get it, and they really are out of touch. And we have this very interesting Wall Street Journal editorial, Romney's Tax Confusion. The candidate's response on the Obamacare mandate reveals larger campaign problems, and it seems that this neocon gang who write the editorials at the Wall Street Journal, they're not happy with Romney's, what can we say, rich dumb guy or liberal Republican types in Boston. They talk about the Boston group. Next it'll be the Boston clique, the Boston coterie, the Boston boys, the Boston cabal. Anyway, this guy Fernstrom seems to be involved and others, and they're not happy that that Romney went out vacationing with a jet ski. It's like Kerry. Remember Kerry with the windsurfing? Now this time it's jet skis being driven by his charming wife Anne. And the lesson here is, if you run on your biography, you can then be hit that way. That is what Kerry, another rich dumb guy, tried to do. Right? Another character, actually not that different from Romney in a number of ways. Sort of looks like him too. Okay, so what's the reality? A couple of principles here. I am not defending an ideology here primarily. No. I am trying to defend the American people. I'm trying to get the best result for the American people I can get under terrible circumstances. I'm also interested in defending the general cause of humanity. So, humanity and one's own people. I think this is the beginning of morality. We have other people who prefer to defend crackpot ideology, Austrianism, libertarianism, and it's leading them down a very dangerous road. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., reminding you to keep up with everything at Tarpley.net and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed. Now, let's continue with this aftermath of the healthcare ruling, because I'm seeing people lose their moorings. Various people are really losing all contact with reality. It's an orgy of pessimism, consternation. They're talking about nullification. Interposition. Those ended at Appomattox, boys. You can forget those. Those are no longer available. And I'm afraid you're getting a lot of in the wake of the betrayal by Ron Paul and Rand Paul, right, as they unmask as cynical deployments of the Romney machine, as wingmen for Romney, and little Rand, of course, still hoping against hope that he can get on the ticket and be projected as a possible vice president and future president. God help us. The demoralization and disorientation in the circles that used to support, or probably still do support, Ron Paul is growing. And what these groups, they seem to have gotten themselves, if you look at something like the Daily Poll, this is opposition to civilization itself. In other words, they're against government, any kind of government. They're against universities. They're against schools. They're against public education. They're against hospitals. They're against doctors. They're against dentists, too. What of civilization remains? There is a general hostility towards the components of what has been understood to be civilization for the last 3,000 years or so. And instead, what do we get? Neo-feudalism. Everybody should be essentially one of the knights of the Holy Roman Empire, right? You can read these accounts, right? Ulrich von Hutten and Götz von Berlichingen, and these people who they were sovereign individuals. They had sovereign individuality. They had their farm, and that was an independent state. They were not subjected to any local prince, but only to the emperor, who was far away and poorly financed. And they say it's such a lot of trouble. I got to put the armor on to go out and plow the field, because at any time I may have to defend my little postage stamp of land. That's where it leads. Neo-feudalism and a breakdown of civilization. It's one of the reasons the Holy Roman Empire was not successful. Not that it was really dominated by this, but it had this as an included feature. So look, by the time this got to the Supreme Court, your alternatives were few. During the time it was being debated, I and others, first of all, demanded Medicare for all, $100 per person per month. And then failing that, don't cut Medicare by $500 billion, and don't go the route of the public mandate, the individual mandate. But that is what then passed. So that creates a fait accompli, a new situation. Therefore, by the time this gets to the Supreme Court in June of 2012, let's say, what are the alternatives? Well, there are two. Well, maybe more, but essentially two. Then there are variations in the middle. One is that they strike down the whole thing, and that's what the fascists and reactionaries wanted to do. Antonin Scalia is a fascist. He should be impeached. Anybody who sidles up to that, including Romney, is in bed with fascism, because that is the only description for the belief structure of one Antonin Scalia, the friend of Cheney, right? The hobnobbing with these reactionaries, and not far behind Clarence Thomas and his reactionary wife and her payroll, on the payroll of various operations that have been linked in the public press with the reactionary Koch brothers. And then we have Alito, presumably of the same type. And then Kennedy joins in that. So there it is. When the vote comes, it's either going to be strike down the whole thing, or the five votes then to uphold this, but at the same time to weaken the state commitment to Medicaid. At that point, what do you want? Which is better? I think it's clear, if you have the 5 votes on the reactionary to fascist opinion in the spirit of Scalia and Thomas, then you've essentially closed the door to any kind of health care expansion by the federal government for a long time, maybe for our lifetimes. The other side of it, it seems to me, offers possibilities for political exploitation. I mean the following. You can now say to people, if you don't have health care and you can't get it because you have a pre-existing condition or you just can't afford it, there's now a promise made to you that you will be able to get a health plan within 18 months. It's a long time. For the rest of 2012 and the entirety of 2013. But in January of 2014, you should be able to get some kind of treatment even if you have a pre-existing condition. And of course, the treatment is not going to be ideal. But again, compare it to the available alternative. Why don't we try being realists instead of being ideologues and fanatics? And let's look at what the possibilities actually are. Now, suppose at the time millions of people come forward, and it's about 50 million people, 50 million Americans, according to the recent statistics from 09-10, don't have any kind of health coverage. They got to pay it all out of pocket or something like this. There are 50 million people that are going to step forward in December of 2013 and January 2014. They're going to say, I demand treatment. I demand a subsidized price. I demand a policy that I can pay for. And at the same time, you can't keep me out because of pre-existing conditions. Well, that creates a new political reality, doesn't it? In other words, what is the attitude of the U.S. middle class towards entitlements? Everybody from Peter Peterson to the Wall Street gang to Ron Paul to Romney, the entire reactionary and fascistoid phalanx is saying, smash entitlements, down with entitlements, let's have Simpson Bowles, let's make the entitlements into the cash cow so we can have bigger and better bailouts. Let's never have a Wall Street sales tax. Let's abolish, as Ron Paul says, abolish the estate tax, abolish the capital gains tax. And, of course, Romney goes various steps in that direction. And all of that, and you won't get any health care. Now, I'm sorry, that's fascism in my book. No, that's not good enough for the American people. We didn't defeat communism, fascism abroad so that we could then succumb to it at home in this way. Now, let's take an example. We hear a lot of hue and cry, huffing and puffing, Sturm und Drang, and it's all about, oh, it's a government takeover. Unfortunately, it's not. I wish it were a government takeover. It's not Medicare for all. It's not even a a public option. Let's look at the state of Texas. For various reasons, it always figures prominently, right? It's one of the problems of this country that the center of gravity in ideological terms has passed from someplace like maybe New York in the 50s and 60s to someplace like Texas. Well, Texas ranks worst in the nation in healthcare services and delivery, according to an annual scorecard issued by the Federal Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. This is, I guess it's today. It's July 6th. And it just came out. Bloomberg Business Week News. In 9 of 12 categories, Texas rated weak or very weak. And there's one exception. We'll talk about it in a minute. The point here is Texas, with this wonderful right to work, right, union-busting state, Texas has 15 million people. And of those adults, 33% have no health insurance. That's the highest of any state. 5 million people in Texas, 1/3 of the entire population. In New York, to give a comparison, it's 20%, 2.4 million. That's tragic, but 1/5 is better than 1/3, right? And we'll continue this comparison in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Let's continue with this interesting survey. Texas, what's the situation of healthcare in Texas? Don't you think this would be something to start campaigning about, to protest about, to go beyond the various issues that are otherwise encumbering the scene, to get to something where people's lives are definitely at stake? We just said Texas has 15 million adults in the population. 5 million have no health care, 33%, the worst in the United States. New York State, by comparison, 2.4 million, 20%. A tragedy, but 1/5 not quite as bad as 1/3. Now, when you look at children, things get a little bit better, but this is not because of Texas. This is because of S-CHIP, right, the State Child Health Insurance Plan. This is something from Ted Kennedy, of all people. But now we're talking at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, what's the outcome? Where does that leave you, the man in the street, right? What now for you? Texas has 17% of the kids, 1.25 million kids, no health care. Now, that's not as bad as for the adults. And again, it's because of big government. Yes, indeed. Big federal government came in with S-CHIP, and that's why the kids are slightly better off. New York, by contrast, 8%. 8%, 17%. Well, 8% is better. Still a tragedy. 370,000 kids in New York State have no health care. And then we look at the United States overall. It's 10%, or 8 million poor kids, no health care. So that just means put more money into S-CHIP. And I'm sorry, don't tell me you don't like vaccines. Don't tell me all of the other things. If people can't see a doctor, then civilization is collapsing. It's time to fight for civilization. Yes, I know institutions are discredited, but the concept of medicine and hospitals and doctors is essential for the preservation of civilization. And people that don't understand that are going to become negative factors on the world stage. Now, let's just look at it overall. The total for the United States of adults and children, children were defined as 0 to 18, adults the rest. For the United States, it's 50 million. It's exactly that 50 million that we come back to again and again. It's the 50 million who are living on food stamps, who have no job, no welfare, no unemployment payments, who are destitute, and they need to be kept alive. There are 50 million Americans. It's the size of France or Italy or Britain, more or less, because in reality, of course, it's more. So by the time when we add in the more, we're probably up to 60 million, and you have a large, big Western European country here among us with no health care. 49,903,900 in 09 to 10. Americans, adults and children, no health care, no way to get to the doctor. Texas, 25%, the absolute worst. So again, Texas is 1/3 of all adults don't have anything. 17% of children result. Texas 25%. And we're told that the Medicaid system in Texas, which is now Medicaid, of course, being in the news because of the Supreme Court decision, that you can have an income, I've heard in this analysis, maybe we can check it, you can have an income of $4,000 a year. That's about 1/3 of poverty for an individual. You can have a $4,000 a year income. You still can't get Medicaid in Texas because the Confederate Freemasons in Austin think that that's a waste of money, right? They're concerned about their deficit and their debt. Well, this is a pretty horrendous picture. I'd like to hear some indignation about that, right? And look at, instead of looking at ideology, look at your fellow man, look at your brother and sister, and then you're going to be called upon to say something at the last judgment, if it happens, about that, right? What did you do? The least of these. What did you do for the least of these? Now, nobody knows better than I do that the system is flawed, but the point is, it is essential for the middle class to see that entitlements are their economic rights, that they've fought for centuries for these things, centuries of labor struggles, political struggles, and so forth. They are not giveaway programs that primarily benefit blacks, Hispanics, the Appalachian poor, poor whites, or whatever it is. These are benefits for all the people. The correct approach to it is to have a political organizing perspective and a reform agenda. If you think that they're underfunded, then fight to get them more funded. If you think that the schedule of vaccines is wrong, then fight to get that reformed. Bring it out into the light of day. If you think that there are other things that are going wrong, a reform agenda, but not, I'm going to retreat to my cellar with my gun, my gold stocks, my food, survivalist food stocks, and I'm going to wait for the revenuers or whatever it is are going to come, the black helicopters, whatever it is. This is crazy. In other words, political engagement is the answer to these things. So I would say, remember that the point with Ron Paul is not just that Ron Paul's a scoundrel or that Rand Paul is a scoundrel. They are. They're Confederate Freemasons. But that Austrianism, libertarianism itself, is a synthetic slave ideology. It is MK Ultra. It's the essence of MK Ultra. It is the ideology peddled by the Mount Pelerin Society, funded by reactionary, pro-fascist, pro-Nazi businessmen who wanted to fight against the tide of human progress, in effect, right, in favor of neo-feudal privilege. These are the princes of privilege and the gluttons of privilege. And if you find yourself in bed with Scalia, repeating arguments from Scalia and other reactionaries or proto-fascists or whatever they are, then you have to ask yourself, what's going on? This is a brainwash. In the 1930s, it was the four horsemen of the apocalypse, reactionaries on the Supreme Court who would come out and strike down some measures that would have benefited working people. They were considered reactionaries, but now they can cloak themselves in this idea that they're libertarians, right? They're not just fighting for the privileges of the few; they're fighting for the market, right? You've shifted the attention away from the concrete, rich dummies that run the system, the Romneys and so forth, Jamie Dimon, Blankfein, and so forth, and you've now taken it to say, well, it's the market that we're defending. Case in point now, Barclays. Let's talk about Barclays. The system, and this is a private sector, this purely private sector. It's deregulated. It could hardly be more deregulated. We're talking LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate. It is the classic worldwide rate at which banks will lend money to other banks. And a conspiracy has been brought to light in the private sector from lack of regulation. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We will get to the LIBOR scandal in just a minute. Just a couple of other points on this Texas issue. The Robert Caro biography of Lyndon B. Johnson coming out now with another volume. And here we find, how did electric power come to the Texas Hill Country near Austin, I believe. Electrification. Did the private sector do it? And the answer is no, the private sector didn't do it. Our heroes of the free market didn't do it. Free market, free private enterprise, they never electrified. They never brought electric power to the poor people of the Texas Hill Country. It was done by big government. Yes, indeed, big government. Lyndon B. Johnson, that exponent of big government, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, that Satan of big government in the eyes of many backward and benighted people. Let the scales fall from their eyes. Some of you people wouldn't have electricity to write with. You wouldn't be able to stay up at night and read a book. You wouldn't be able to have a laundromat. You wouldn't be able to have a dishwasher. Lyndon B. Johnson ran for Congress in the Texas Hill Country, and he said to women, he said, "I will make your lives easier so that by the time you get to be 50, you will not look like your own mother. You'll have had a better life." Yeah, that I think that's a fine example. And the idea that people should not be crushed by poverty and exclusion. You can see this in the life of some real Texas populists, and Lyndon B. Johnson certainly was one. Of course, once you get the Harvard boutique with McGeorge Bundy and the rest of these characters telling him that it's time for the Vietnam War, then he goes off the tracks. But in terms of the populist economics, he had some examples of it. Let's take another case. We're told, oh, the Constitution is being violated. This is ridiculous. This is the Jefferson view of the Constitution. We're now celebrating the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 proves to us that Jefferson and Madison were absolute failures as presidents. They were catastrophic failures as presidents of the United States. Because Jefferson said, oh, I don't like big government, so I'm going to have no army and no navy. And there was a dangerous foe. It was called the British Empire, and they were still holding forts in the Ohio Territory, the old Northwest, up to the Mississippi River. And they had threatening forces inside Canada, and they were inciting, yes, Indian tribes were being incited to commit massacres in the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York and other such places. So the British were there. But Jefferson said, no, I'm against big government. So no army, no navy. And then a little bit later, in 1811, you get the end of the Bank of the United States. The survival of the United States for the first 20 years was absolutely dependent on Alexander Hamilton's first Bank of the United States. This was the way in which the United States could maintain circulation of money, insulate itself against the constant economic warfare threats coming from London and elsewhere in the world. When this lapsed in 1811, the finances of the federal government went to hell, and we had the Girard Bank seizing control of the state of Pennsylvania, and we had John Jacob Astor trying to seize control over the government in Washington, and very nearly succeeding. So 200 years ago, the British burn Washington, attack Baltimore. They don't do so well in the Great Lakes, thank goodness, but you get the idea. And Madison continues this. So the two cardinal sins of having no military at all when you needed it, it's different than today, but in those days it was real. And the lesson that really remains valid is you better have a national bank. You better have a Hamiltonian national bank. Jefferson and Madison almost destroyed the United States. If it had been up to them alone, the United States would have been finished in 1814. Gone. Kaput. Out of the picture. And the other thing, of course, is the lunatics that we hear is the enumerated powers. Again, Jefferson was a crackpot, but he had the virtue of not believing his own propaganda. So when the time came for the Louisiana Purchase, he made it, even though he had to say, oh, I'm so torn because it's not an enumerated power. Get busy and pursue the general welfare. But this is the bankrupt tradition. Now, in the 20th century, we found that the Constitution was one of the favorite refuges of fascists. And there's one in particular. You can read about it in the books of Seldes, right? George Seldes, Facts and Fascism, and 1,000 Americans, right? The fascist roots of today's U.S. ruling class. Same thing, right? Union busting, shifting the tax burden from the rich to the poor, and so forth. And Seldes writes about the Committee for Constitutional Government. The Committee for Constitutional Government had been founded above all by a guy called Frank Gannett. This is the Gannett newspapers. This is USA Today. Their ancestor, Gannett, founded the Committee for the Defense of the Constitution. And in the floor of the House, this group was denounced as the #1 fascist organization in the United States. The top fascist outfit, the top fascist group, the Committee for the Defense for Constitutional Government. There was another one called the Southern Committee for the Defense of the Constitution, which was similar. Fascist, reactionary, union busting, anti-worker, anti-people, only in favor of the rich few. No child labor laws. We're getting that now from Senator Lee out there in Utah or Nevada or wherever it is. And who made that charge? Well, there were real Texas populists. Wright Patman of Texas. Wright Patman was the real enemy of the Federal Reserve, not the fake one, not the token opposition of Ron Paul, who serves to marginalize and discredit whatever he touches because of his crackpot Austrian ideology. Wright Patman was somebody they really feared. Wright Patman was the first guy who said, follow the money on Watergate, right? Wright Patman is a whole story. That was a real Texas populist. Since we're talking about Texas populists, I have to mention the one that I had an honor to meet, Senator Ralph Webster Webster Yarborough, the guy who passed the National Defense Education Act, so various people could get a graduate education during the Cold War. That was Senator Yarborough of Texas. And the two key things with these people were infrastructure, build infrastructure, and put money into education. And the Confederate Republican Party of today is useless, hopeless on both of those. They hate infrastructure and they hate education. So that was Wright Patman. LBJ, Wright Patman, and Senator Yarborough. Those are some examples of the positive tradition in Texas. And if you wanted to mount some kind of a serious opposition against Wall Street rule, you would start with the example of those three figures. I would submit. There have been others. Henry Gonzalez tried to carry on, and did carry on, the tradition of Wright Patman. Now, let's get back to LIBOR and this conspiracy which has come to light. The proofs of a conspiracy. LIBOR, London Interbank Offered Rate. It is the benchmark rate for a whole mass of different contracts, arrangements, derivatives around the world. And it simply means this. Every morning at 11 o'clock in London, there's a group of 16, sometimes 18 banks who report the rate at which they could borrow money if they wanted to. It's pure private sector. It's totally deregulated. It was deregulated once by Thatcher in the 80s. It was deregulated again by Gordon Brown of the Labour Party in the late 90s. It's deregulated. Let's hear how it went awry in the free market. Let's push ahead. We've got to wrap up with the LIBOR scandal in London. This is the British Banking Association, the BBA. BBA LIBOR, 11 a.m. every business day, 16 or 18 banks get on the phone and they say, what's the rate at which you could borrow money? Well, it became a conspiracy. It turned into a cartel. Now, so far, Barclays Bank has been the main target, right? Barclays Bank was clearly part of this illegal rigging, manipulation, the kind of thing that Michele Ruggero of Italy has been investigating in regard to Standard & Poor's and the other ratings agencies. Here's market manipulation through the fakery of statistics, right? Because there was no reporting in any regulated way, but just, whatever they wanted to say, and no verification, no checkup. So they set it sometimes higher than reality, sometimes lower. It depended on their speculative positions and the needs of their cancerous, bankrupt mass of kited derivatives. So LIBOR, and then they set that every morning at 11 a.m., and then they send it over to Thomson Reuters, and it goes out to the world. Now, we're talking about the years 2007, 2008. We're talking about the build-up to the big panic, the world derivatives panic of 2008. And the idea is, you remember in those days, they were looking at LIBOR to see how scared banks were, and what now transpires is that the LIBOR was fake. It was crooked, and either the fear was less or more than reality. So it's a cartel. What they do, if it's 16, if they get different numbers from each of the banks, they eliminate the lowest 4, they eliminate the highest 4, and then they take an average of the 8 in the middle. So in order to manipulate that, you would really have to control just about all of those banks, right? You'd have to have control. You'd have to have a criminal conspiracy, RICO conspiracy of the 16 banks. So that's the prima facie case. So who's involved in the telephone call? Barclays Bank. Again, this guy, Diamond, has been forced out. He wanted to stay. He's been forced out. And you've also got this very incriminating telephone call where people from Barclays are on the phone with the Bank of England, and there's climate of collusion. In other words, the Bank of England guy doesn't say, stop fixing the rates. He says, oh, the rate is a little bit too high. Don't you think you could make it a little bit lower? So, in other words, they're colluding with a wink and a nod in what's going on. So the Bank of England is implicated, but otherwise it's Barclays Bank. The Royal Bank of Scotland was the biggest bank in the world, blew up in 2008. I think it's still controlled by the British government. HSBC, this is Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. This is the dope trade of the 19th century living on. HSBC seems to be the second largest bank in the world these days. Then we have good old Bank of America, the mortgage kings, involved again, right? They lost $40 billion on Mozilla. Maybe they made some of it back by fixing the London interbank offered rate. Citigroup is involved. J.P. Morgan, not just the London whale, but now this London cartel conspiracy. UBS, Union Bank of Switzerland, and Deutsche Bank. That's what determines Merkel's policies, right? She doesn't give money to Greece. She gives it to Deutsche Bank. This is now being probed by the Bundeskartellamt, I believe it's called, or whatever they call that these days. You've also got other groups, ICAP, ICAP. That is a guy called Spencer. He's a top finance advisor to Cameron, the Prime Minister. So the British Banking Association and the Financial Services Administration knew in the year 2007 that this collusion was going on. And the British, the Bank of England guy on the phone was Paul Tucker. Paul Tucker, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, told Barclays, your rate is a little bit too high. Can't you get it down a little bit? Now, the minimum loot, this is a lowball estimate, is $75 billion. That's ridiculous. There is a lawsuit by the city of Baltimore, Go Baltimore, and Charles Schwab, the brokers. They want $110 billion from Barclays and $126 billion from Royal Bank of Scotland, and we hope they go all the way, because that would wipe out these two zombie banks. Got to get rid of them somehow. So this essentially means that the freest market, the least regulated, is the London one, right? Again, 2 rounds of deregulation, the Thatcher Big Bang of the late 80s and then Gordon Brown's secondary shock of the late 90s. It is totally deregulated. It's as free can be, and here's what you get. It is time to wrap up the zombie banks, to resolve them, right? To put them through Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation, cancel their derivatives, shred, delete all derivatives, and you need a big criminal investigation. But of course, that's the prelude to removing these zombies from the picture and then proceeding with a recovery program of the type that we've talked about. LIBOR means lie more. The more you lie, the bigger the profits are. Really, all the UK zombie banks are members of a cartel. So there we have it. Now, just a couple of short notes. Now, we wanted to begin our expose of Romney. I don't think we have enough. Well, let's just go through Romney's big money, right? The thing about Romney's secrecy. We had this before, but let's repeat it again. I think we have some new details. Vanity Fair, Associated Press, and the left lib David Korn, foundation funded, are now going after Romney. Romney is the owner of the Sancati High Yield Asset Investors Limited. It transferred from Mitt to Ann before Mitt became governor of Massachusetts. So that's in Bermuda. But we have Romney's money secretly socked away in 7 countries: in Bermuda, in Ireland, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Germany, and in Austria, and in the Cayman Islands, where he's apparently got about a dozen investment vehicles going. The obvious demand here is, we demanded Obama's birth certificate. We did that right here. As long as that was a useful issue, as long as that was going to get you anywhere and maybe remove him from contention, that was the demand. Now the demand is, we want to see Romney's tax returns of the last 30 years. We want to see all of his tax returns going back, maybe to be fair, 1984, the year he founded Bain Capital. 1984, Bain Capital founded. That's what we want. In particular, we want the tax returns of the 14 years that he was at Bain, from 1984 until about 1998, 99, 2000, when he then moved on to the Olympics, where he covered up for the Mormons who had been bribing foreign countries and committing other criminal activity, right? Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States. Romney is worth $250 million, but he nevertheless paid a 14% tax rate, less than many people who make far less. He had $22 million of income in 2010, but that's only a small part of the picture. We want to see all of those tax returns. And since we are dealing with somebody who is socking this money away, he's exporting jobs, right? He's destroying jobs here, and he's exporting them to some extent anyway, at least jobs for accountants and croupiers. How about an undistributed profit tax? Right? This goes back to the New Deal. We're told that these U.S. companies have trillions of dollars of cash, but they don't want to invest them because, oh gosh, it's so uncertain, and oh gosh, you never know what Obama will do next. Maybe an undistributed profits tax would concentrate their attention. In other words, if you hoard that money, you will pay a tax on it, right? Be it 5% or 10% or whatever we decide it's going to be. That will help you to realize that it's better to go out and invest it. That would certainly be part of the mix. The last thing we wanted to mention is Rand Paul acting more and more like a Southern Confederate lawmaker. He's harassing the government of the District of Columbia. He's been voting to prevent them from having their own budget and bringing in his obsessions with abortion, gun control, and other things that the residents of the District of Columbia don't want. So we'll have more about that next week on World Crisis Radio. People who are this feckless. And, of course, the question comes up, if these Gulf states are so concerned about the Syrian-Iranian bloc, how come they haven't embargoed oil to these countries, to, in particular, China, right? Since the big hysteria is about Russia and China. China needs oil imports. The Gulf could do some, but you don't see them doing it. So, as usual, ready to fight to the last American or ready to fight to the last NATO trooper, but not willing to do anything. Just a sidelight on the hypocrisy of these people. We do have an interesting statement from the Iraqi foreign minister. The Iraqi foreign minister says Al-Qaeda is streaming into Syria. The terrorists of the entire Eurasian landmass operating under the Al-Qaeda trademark are streaming into Syria. big time. And we've also got a very interesting sidelight. Switzerland has cut off arms shipments to Qatar and the United Arab Emirates because they've found hand grenades in Syria being used, obviously, by the butchers, by the NATO death squads deployed by the Negroponte Ford combine. Those hand grenades made in Switzerland, so the Swiss are getting freaked out. And obviously they're afraid of liability issues, right? People who get killed with that can sue the Swiss government. So there we go with this situation. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Just one other note on this guy, Tlass, right? The apparently Sunni son, the general, son of the long-term weakness, was on parade. And the tirade was against Russia and China, really more than Assad. Russia and China, she says, have been blocking the wonderful international community in their desire to overthrow the existing government of Syria, which is a United Nations member state. So she says it's time to, for everybody, I think there are 60 countries taking part in this confab, not Russia, not China, not Syria, as usual, right? The Munich model obtains. Don't invite the country that's being discussed. So she says it's time for the 60 who did come to put Russia and China under pressure, that it's time for them to pay a price. She raves. So far they haven't paid a price, but now everybody here has got to gang up on them and make sure that they pay a price for their behavior. And then we had her lapdog this time around was the German foreign minister, Westerwelle, Guido Westerwelle, who says the Russians are on the wrong side of history and they've got to understand that. Oh, my God. Another step down for the Merkel regime and another step closer to being thrown out of office, because the economic future of Germany, needless to say, depends on good relations with Russia, not disturbed by these idiotic issues that are brought in by the Anglo-Americans. Fabius, our friend Le Roquet, right, the attack dog, the cur, Laurent alias the cur, Fabius, gloats over the defection of a general. This is now the son of a guy called Tlass. Well, if you've been around the Middle East for a while, you know Tlass. This name is already a program. Tlass has now become a hero of democracy. Okay, Tlass has a father. His father has been the defense minister in Syria for quite a few decades. And this is a guy who said, I sent the suicide bombers to kill the U.S. Marines, but he didn't send them to kill the Italians because he was in love with Gina Lollobrigida, the famous actress. And he's also got another speech where he celebrates what he alleges was cannibalism against Israeli prisoners on the Golan Heights. So that's the father. So this is now the hero of democracy. The son of that is now the hero of democracy. And, of course, the elder Tlass was a feature of the Hafez Assad regime, which I think, based on my experience in Syria, was oppressive. The Hafez Assad regime was something more akin to what the U.S. and the British say about Bashar. But of course, Bashar is a reformer. This is exactly what they don't like. So when you had Hafez Assad, we had Henry Kissinger saying, I have a soft spot in my heart for Hafez Assad, and they always did. But now that you have a modernizing reformer in the person of Bashar, and the situation strategically has changed, now they want to overthrow the government. So the son of Tlass, that's really a great credential. Anyway, Fabius thought that was great. Of course, radically anti-historical. Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley reporting from Washington, D.C. with a busy week as the world depression and the world strategic crisis unfolds. Let's go right away to Syria. We've had, in the last 24 hours, a psychotic episode in public by Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has won the Ribbentrop Award, awarded in the tradition of Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi foreign minister who had a bad end after Nuremberg. His hypocrisy, his superficiality, his stupidity, his hysteria were watchwords. We have had a real hysterical rant by Hillary Clinton at the French conference called Amis du Peuple Syrien, the friends of the Syrian people. Man, with friends like this, you don't need enemies. They want to hit the Syrian people with more killer economic sanctions, economic warfare. These are the stranglers who are in command for the moment. The bombers, of course, eager to seize control. Hillary Clinton, of course, is a bomber. Her personality weakness is such that unless she's the biggest warmonger in the room, she has a psychological breakdown, because that means she's weak, and of course that lets her in on all of these terrible things that have been said about women for all these years. So the answer to being a woman is to be essentially the biggest butcher and warmonger around, and then you can feel safe. Well, that is exactly the definition of weakness, as I've tried to point out quite a few times. So I don't remember any of this other stuff. Maybe some groups will remind him of what's going on. Lavrov, since we're talking about foreign ministers, Lavrov of Russia was asked this week, is it true that Moscow is going to offer President Assad diplomatic asylum here, political asylum in Russia? And he said, this is a joke. This is a bad joke. And the hapless Westerwelle was there for that one, too. And Lavrov said, why don't you ask Westerwelle here whether they're going to take him in Germany? An interesting turn of phrase. So that is the Friends of Syria conference. We're also told behind the scenes, the Gulf monarchies, the feudal, absolute, reactionary monarchies of the Gulf, right? The United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, the various Oman and Saudi Arabia above all, right? The Jupiter around which all of these things rotate. They're pessimistic. They say the Free Syrian Army is not effective. The Free Syrian Army, we had to hear on NPR this morning, is not as good as the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. Not as good. Not as good as the fighters led by Belhaj Hassadi coming out of Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk. Not as good. So the Free Syrian Army is militarily feckless. One of their strongholds near Idlib has been conquered by the Syrian, or retaken, liberated by the Syrian army today. So the Gulf states are getting nervous about the bet that they're making